Welcome to Chair Flying 2.0. We're going to be talking today about can flight sims help student pilots? And I phrase it this way because a lot of folks have thought about flight simulators as being really something that is mostly for instrument flying. And while it is excellent for instrument flying, there is a lot of value that people leave on the table while they're going through private pilot training. So just a bit about myself. This is basically my story. I started with flight simulation back in around 2000. And when I got it, the first thing my mom told me was, don't you ever think about becoming a pilot? And as you can see, I didn't listen to her very well. So that's kind of my background. I started in simulation and, when I was in quite young. And then eventually that's what sparked the interest into becoming a pilot as a career. So I've worked as a flight instructor for quite some time. I, for a short while, was a first officer on the Embraer 175, former engineer at Boeing, and founder now of Flight Sim Coach. In our company, we help people use their flight sim at home with remote instruction. So today we'll talk about, can simulators actually help you get your pilot certificate? One of the first questions that, a lot of people ask is, isn't it just a game? And a lot of people, use flight simulators as a game. So you certainly can get a lot of enjoyment out of a sim as a game and, have fun with it. As you can see, I was here some years ago, but it really comes down to how you're going to use the simulator. So, if you're going to be just doing barrel rolls all day and, not having any discipline about what you're doing, then sure, it's a game. But if you're going to use it and debrief yourself, use the replay mode, set failures and treat it seriously, the same as you would in a real aircraft, then that's where the value comes in. That makes it much more than a game. So let's start right from the beginning with one of the biggest questions we get about flight simulation, which is it going to feel like a real airplane? Or people hear like, I know it's not going to feel like a real airplane, so I shouldn't use it, right? Well, the answer to that is no, it's not going to feel like a real airplane. Now you can come closer to it feeling like a real airplane if you invest a lot of money. This example in the lower right here is a high-end force feedback yoke that will actually, let you feel those aerodynamic forces on the airplane. And those run, over $1,000 just for that yoke. So, most people aren't investing that much, so it's not going to feel like a real airplane. But the question I, pose back to people is, well, we always talk about chair flying as students or as pilots and how that has a lot of value. By chair flying, we mean sitting in a chair, kind of thinking through and rehearsing various procedures or debriefing your flights, things like that. And we all agree that that's super valuable. So I would ask, does chair flying feel like flying a real airplane? And the answer is obviously no, there's no feel at all. So certainly, the feel aspect doesn't devalue the rest of your simulation experience. There's many other factors that go into whether a simulator is going to, have realism. So there's things like the systems of the simulator. There's the air traffic control aspect of the simulator. We have the weather. All the other pieces other than feel are still there. And, they may not be perfect, but, that 95% realism can get us quite far when we're trying to prepare for pilot training. The way I like to think of this question, the way I put it is, you have your real Cessna 172, let's say, and then you have to think of your simulator 172 as kind of being its own separate airplane, and it has its own unique flying characteristics. It's going to maybe be a little lighter on the yoke and, a bit harder to trim the airplane, things like that. They're two different, airplanes, so to speak. If you think of it that way, I think that helps a lot of people that are hung up on, well, it's not going to feel exactly the same. Well, any two airplanes you fly, even the same model of 172 sometimes will have slight differences. So if anything, this is a good thing for you as a pilot to increase your adaptability. Now, when you're a student, it is good to keep the number of variables as low as possible. You don't want to be jumping around to different airplanes every other week, right? But, if you have these two airplanes, your Sim 172 and the real 172, it's manageable. I mean, if you have the chance to start in the real airplane first, that will help give you better perspective. But there's certainly advantages to starting Sim first as well from a cost standpoint. The sim is almost always harder, by the way, as the guys on the call, Randy and Rich, probably already know, having experienced both sides. The sim tends to be harder to trim because you don't have that same feel and the feedback that you would get in the seat of your pants like you would in a real airplane. You don't have the accelerations and all the other cues that we use to fly smoothly. So if you can fly the sim well, probably you're going to do a much better job in the real airplane when you have all that other information available. The other common question that we get is, won't I focus too much on the instruments? And this is a fair concern for sure. So, a lot of pilots that started in simulation, they go to their first flying lessons and their instructors have to, they note that, they're just staring at the instruments the whole time. And a lot of that, I think, comes down to just how people set up their views on their panel. I mean, if you're looking at a panel like this is from Flight Sim 2000, by the way. So it tended to be a lot less compelling to look anywhere other than the panel with these old sims. And I think that's partly why, people have this fixation on, well, you're going to focus too much on the instruments. But if you look at the panel like this, then yeah, you're probably going to develop some bad habits of looking too much outside at the instruments. But on the other hand, if we look at a modern sim like Microsoft Flight Sim 2020, and if you set up your views, maybe something more like what you see here in the background image, where we're not focusing on the panel, but if you, set up your view kind of at that same sort of perspective and sizing, like it's a real airplane panel, size-wise, and we're kind of having the outside visuals fill up more of the top of the screen compared to instruments, then that can go a long way as well. I mean, picture practicing steep turns, like this, versus what I just showed you in the other slide, right? So, you're going to be able to focus on all those things your instructor in real life would be telling you about, trying to maintain that proper sight picture of where the cowling intersects the horizon and things like that. It's just a matter of how you set up your views. I see in the chat mention that with 3 monitors, 43-inch in the middle, 32 on the sides, it's going to be much easier and more compelling to focus on the outside visual. The next way that you can kind of address this is with the virtual reality headset, which we'll touch on a bit more later. But it really gives you that feeling that you're actually there in this immersive environment where you'll be even more able and cognizant of what's going on outside and able to practice proper scanning and using sight pictures and so forth. The other thing that we do as remote instructors sometimes, which it's a bit harder to do yourself, but if you get creative, you might find a way, is to just kind of cover up the panel. Like you've heard of the old instructor that takes a sectional chart to cover up the whole panel so that someone will stop focusing so much on the instruments. Well, we can do the same thing during our remote flying lessons, or you could literally just take a sticky note on your monitor and cover it up that way yourself too. And a very simple way to get yourself to focus less on the instruments, perhaps you cover up everything other than your altimeter, for example, and then you can focus on straight and level with like the bare minimum information coming from the panel. That way you're focused more out here. So moving on, next question we get a lot of times is, won't I pick up bad habits and then I'm going to have to spend time in the airplane later correcting those bad habits? And that's also a possibility. Now, not to plug what we do too much here at this point, but the easiest way to get around this is to have a instructor who's qualified, the CFI, let's say, to be alongside you as you're flying the sim. And you don't need to use a remote instructor for your entire training, but having someone there during those first few lessons, at least, we can do things like what I mentioned of covering up the instruments. We can also see how you're controlling the instruments, how you're controlling the airplane with some cool plugins we've developed where, this lets the remote instructor see how you're making control inputs, if you're using your trim and things like that. So we can, give you that feedback of making sure you're not holding excessive control pressures and make sure you're using your rudder, things of that nature. So that's one of the things that's available as a tool. This is our group of instructors that, are all super experienced CFIs that can help you with this. So that's a bit of, kind of covering some of the top questions we get about, why people feel like they maybe shouldn't use a sim during flights, during private pilot training, and a few of the mitigations to those issues. Next, I'd like to get into the question of, well, what does it take to put together a home flight simulator, and roughly what does it cost? So for any simulator, there are three pieces that you need. You need to have a computer, you need some sort of flight controls, and some sort of software. The computer piece is usually going to be your most expensive investment, but for some of you, you may already have a computer that's capable of running a simulator. So just keep that in mind. You may not even need to purchase a new computer, depending on what simulator you're planning to use. But we'll dive into some different configurations in a few minutes of possible simulators that you might consider putting together. But these are the three main components that any sim will need to have. In theory, you could fly with a keyboard and mouse and skip this step here, but I definitely don't recommend that. It's you'll be very frustrated with the experience. And that's really, as we go along in these different configurations, part of the common thing to keep in mind is, you can get away with a very simple simulator, like this first configuration we'll be looking at here, just a laptop and joystick, let's say. But there's the question of, are you actually going to use this thing? Because while you can get a ton of training value out of it, if you don't enjoy using it, you're probably not going to use it very much. If it feels, super cheap and low quality, and it feels, a lot less like a real airplane, it's going to be less enjoyable to fly. So just keep that in mind. Like, yeah, in theory, I'm going to show you here a very simple entry point into simulation, but if you can invest a bit more, you'll find that you enjoy using it more, and therefore you get more value out of it. So to start with, here's what a basic flight simulator could look like, and it's very lowest level. You have a laptop. It doesn't have to be a gaming laptop. Normal MacBook can potentially run a simulator like X-Plane, and then you have a joystick. A joystick like this will give you control of the throttle. This is basically a twist dial here for throttle control. Of course, you've got your aileron and elevator on the rest of the joystick, and then you can actually twist the joystick for rudder. So in theory, this gives you all of the controls that you need, and the investment is about $30 for a yoke like this. So this is like a $30 joystick. In terms of the computer, if you're looking at maybe you already have an older PC or a Mac that you can already use, so no investment there. If you want something that's newer, very basic, maybe around $500. And then the software, X-Plane, it tends to run better on lower end systems. That's about $30 for the old version of X-Plane. So you can see the investment is fairly small, just to get going with something simple. Now, what kind of training value can you get from something like this, though? What can you learn? Well, definitely you'll learn about the instruments and avionics, just as well as you would with any other simulator, to be able to go through the menus on your GPS and get familiar with, how your different flight instruments react in certain conditions. You'll be able to practice talking to air traffic control just as well as you would in another simulator. So there's tools that are called Pilot Edge and VATSIM we'll get into a bit later, but these allow you to connect any simulator to a network of human controllers that you can actually practice with extremely realistically to hone your radio communications. So all this you could do very easily with a basic sim setup. All right. So let's look at kind of a level up from that. This is what I would call more of a mid-range simulator. We'll kind of talk through some of the characteristics. So here we've got a nicer monitor. We have something that's a bit wider and more immersive. They have monitors that are even wider, like a 49-inch ultra wide, for example, that give you that wraparound feeling, which is really nice. So it will give you more motivation and make it easier for you to focus on the outside of the airplane when you've got a setup like this. We have a question from Rich. Aren't VATSIM and Pilot Edge aimed more at IFR flying? So Pilot Edge, definitely not. I would say it's equally well suited for IFR and VFR because it really is designed as a training tool. VATSIM, on the other hand, is full of a lot more hobbyist pilots that, they're younger folks maybe, or, not so young, but they want to simulate the experience of flying airliners. And, for that reason, because that tends to be what you see more of on VATSIM, it tends to be more IFR focused. But definitely on either one, you can fly VFR, but I would recommend Pilot Edge as being a more serious training tool where you'll have a better experience for a VFR flight. So good question. Okay, so we talked about the monitor. We can see here that the controls that we're using in a sim setup like this are a bit higher end. This is, I'd say, a good, kind of mid-range set of flight controls. The Honeycomb Alpha and Bravo, they're going to run about 500 or 600 for the set of two. And, they have a lot of features here, a lot of switches and things that help you get a bit more muscle memory. They actually have a trim wheel and, various autopilot controls as well. So this is a good step up from a basic joystick, but it does cost quite a bit more. You can even look into hardware panels like this here. So if you want to be able to get training value in terms of muscle memory so that, you're not spending a lot of time in the airplane fumbling around with buttons and your fingers kind of just know where to go to press direct to change the knob to, set your home airport, enter, that sort of thing, then that's where these physical units could be useful. I don't think it's always worth the investment, but for some people who really want to do everything they can to prepare at home, then that's something that's out there for purchase. The one in the middle is, I think, a good middle ground between, a sim like I showed you on the previous slide versus, doing a sim that's full of these units, which is to have a custom touchscreen panel where you can configure, this has got a GNS 430 here, and then you can configure, exactly how you want your panel to look just by moving these instruments around. And this is called Air Manager. It lets you set up a custom panel, and then you can basically use touchscreen to interact with certain things. Like if you want to change the altimeter, which for some strange reason is on the left here in this panel, you would just tap the barometric pressure knob, and then you would go over to this knob here, which is called a knobster. It runs for about $100, but it gives you control of basically any knob in this panel here. So you could, after you touch that initial knob, you can then use the physical knob here to control the altimeter settings. Same thing for the GPS radios and so forth. So it's kind of a way to avoid having to purchase a bunch of separate panels, and you get this all in one solution. Okay, other features of this setup, the Pilot here has a iPad with their ForeFlight. So again, that's going to allow you to get even more immersed in the experience of, using the charts in the same way you would in the real airplane. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Just to recap, the improved value that you get from a sim like this with these higher end controls, you can practice more of the muscle memory of things like trimming instead of using buttons. You're going to have better visuals outside because presumably you've spent more money on a computer that can run the latest Microsoft flight sim. We'll try to touch on the differences between Microsoft flight sim and X-Plane, but you'll have a computer that can generate more detailed graphics. So you'll be able to see, this field here looks exactly like it does in real life. And that could be good for practicing your simulated engine failures, things like that. So that's kind of what I'd call a mid-range simulator. Now, to any of these simulators, you could add on a virtual reality headset. And it's hard to explain what this feels like until you've tried it. But if you ever go to Best Buy or electronic stores that have one to demo, I would see if you can put one on, because it'll really help you understand firsthand what it's like. But basically, everything is going to feel like it's proportioned as it would in real life. You'll basically be able to look around you in all directions and see exactly what you would in real life. It feels like you're there pretty much, other than, not actually being able to touch all the different things that you see. So for immersion and getting that sense of like, okay, I'm actually doing this, which is really important for treating the sim seriously, a VR headset is a really good thing to consider for private pilot training. They have a very wide range of prices. The cheapest is around 400-ish for, the Quest 3, I think, is in the 4 to 500 range. And then there's, more advanced ones that are above, 1,000, 1,500 and more. But it comes down to what your budget is and how good your computer is, but you can find one that'll kind of fit those two things, generally speaking. But when you have this, you're able to really practice a lot of the habits your instructor would like you to, things like, looking over your shoulder to check for traffic before you make your turns, being able to, do your flow checks by just looking down at the center pedestal, things like that. So highly recommend VR for private pilot training students. Next, we'll take a look at a high-end simulator. So some of the defining characteristics here, what do we have? So we have a visual setup, which I think is similar to what, if I remember, Rich was saying, where we've got kind of a triple monitor with that wraparound feeling, which makes it a little bit easier to practice the visual cues you would have, for example, during landing flare. You have physical units for these G1000s. You have some nice higher end rudder pedals, the Thrustmaster rudder pedals. This guy's got his headset hooked up. He has a full, frame set up. So this is like the next level up. Do you need any of this? You don't. But if you expect that you're going to be in this for the long term and you want something you're going to enjoy using and that feels realistic and everything is kind of in the right spot, as opposed to having things on your desk, maybe in a weird arrangement, then I highly recommend looking at a sim like this. So from there, there's also aircraft-specific simulators. There's a company called Real Sim Gear that, if you're a Cirrus pilot, they sell, the actual side stick, one-to-one replica and all of the Garmin Perspective avionics units in the right spot that they should be. So that sort of thing is out there as well. So you can make it, very true to life. One of the folks that had signed up for the class was asking about certified simulators, or at least, simulators at the flight school and what to look for in those. And also, is it worth using a certified sim compared to something like you can easily get at home, which is not certified, Microsoft Flight Sim or X-Plane with your standard hardware. So certified sims are good if you want official training credit, or if you don't want to, have anything to do with a simulator at your house at all, then by all means, a certified sim is a good tool. But in terms of, is it worth it? These sims are generally renting for around $100 an hour, thereabouts, plus the instructor. So, it can be worth it for someone that, maybe they would be finishing in 40 hours, but they want to reduce that down by, I believe it's around 2.5 hours is the credit you can get for private pilot training with a sim. So in that case, it could be worth it. But aside from that, for the typical person that's finishing in maybe 60 or 80 hours, it's not going to really have a benefit for you to have this loggable time compared to just doing things at home. That could, help you just shave off the number of hours that you need in the airplane because you're more proficient, right? So even though the stuff you do at home isn't going to count in your logbook, it's still something that can help you get, closer to this 40-hour minimum if you're trying to save on cost. So these certified sims, they're really not necessarily better in any way. They've gone through a process that, make sure that they meet certain standards. But you can see, some of the quality of the hardware here. It doesn't necessarily look better or more realistic than what we looked at on the previous pages. The thing is, it's far more expensive. So really the only rationale I would say to use one of these, aside from just the fact that they may be more immersive and let you practice that muscle memory more than your home sim, generally may not be worth the extra cost. All right. So next, I'd like to talk about kind of what are sims bad at before we talk about more of the benefits and the ways that you can specifically use them during training. Let's just kind of cut to the chase and what should we not use a simulator for? So the first thing is motion. Unless you have a very advanced simulator, like these multi-million-dollar simulators that have very good motion systems, it's not going to feel the same. You're not going to be able to fly by the seat of your pants. You're not going to feel that stress of being bumped around in turbulence and things like that. And for that reason, sims can never replace that flight experience, right? We always need to be able to deal with, that being in the real environment, the weather, the sweat, all those things that you're not going to get in a home simulator typically. So that's the first thing. Of course, the control feel we touched on before, it's never going to feel exactly like the real airplane. But if you can treat it as if it's its own airplane, it's not a Cessna 172, it's a Sim 172 that is probably a lot harder to fly and trim and maintain altitude, then it helps to set your mindset in a bit more productive way. But the exact control feel, I mean, even in the multi-million-dollar sims at the airlines, when when I trained in the Embraer sim and you go to the real airplane, it feels different. It's close, but not quite there. The peripheral vision and immersion is also very tough to simulate properly. And this is one of the things, peripheral vision, that we do use when we're trying to flare the airplane, to kind of be able to see out of the corner of your eye how fast the runway is coming up so you can make the proper control inputs. This is tough unless you have a VR headset. So that would be the mitigation here, is to consider VR if you can, but not all of us want to deal with that, which is fine, but it's one of the downsides, is that it's less immersive. The other one is muscle memory. So if you don't have one of these full, panel setups with all of the buttons and switches, then yeah, there's going to be some things that you have to use your mouse for or keyboard for, and you won't be able to get the exact practice for muscle memory. So that's that. And then the final one is, you don't have that risk of injury or death, which unless you're doing something very wrong in your home simulator. But the reason I put this is because it can, kind of create a different mindset when you're flying your sim that could lead to bad habits if you don't treat it seriously. So, when you're in that real environment, that everything's on the table, versus being in your sim when you can cut corners. That's where sims can have a bit of a trap, let's say. Ways to mitigate that are really to be disciplined with your sim, and potentially to fly with remote instructors like we offer, to be able to hold you to that higher standard and do things the right way. So anyway, that's where sims I feel are not so good. Now we'll focus now on where sims are good, and I would say that pretty much everything else they have become very good at, surprisingly so. Because if you look at, the slide that I showed in the very beginning of that sim from 2000, a lot of these things I wouldn't be able to say the same thing about. But now things have progressed technology-wise where we can do quite a bit more. So the one that's, an easy sell is procedures and checklists, to be able to go through, whether it's your run-up checklist and things like that in the same way you would in the real airplane. That's a no-brainer. Avionics, depending on what avionics you use, there may or may not be a very good simulation for it, but a lot of them come quite close to be able to practice the basics of how do you input a flight plan, and how do you, use the knobs, all things that if you can not have to spend brain energy on when you're in the airplane, it will make your training in real life go more smoothly. Same thing with using your EFB. You can hook up your ForeFlight to the simulator, be able to see your airplane in the same way you would in real life, like that. Air traffic control we talked about. There's Pilot Edge and VATSIM are excellent tools to be able to practice ATC exactly as you would in real life, using all the same frequencies and procedures. Emergencies, navigation. This one here is a big one that I think is underutilized, which is the idea of repetition. So we know that in a sim, we can pause things. We can replay a scenario and debrief ourselves immediately after we've done something, versus in the airplane, we have to wait, an hour or something before our instructor gives us a debrief. And then the idea of deliberate practice is, something that is going to allow us to hone in on a very specific issue that we're having, and to be able to address it, basically with a clear plan, and to try practicing it over and over and over again. So we'll look at an example in my simulator once we switch to the sim portion here in a moment. But the ability to repeat things over and over again is a huge win for sims versus flying in real life, where you have to wait until maybe a week from your last lesson to try something again. And then the other piece is what I would say is like scanning patterns and mental processes. Like, where do your eyes need to be moving while you're flying an approach? A lot of students, they tend to be focused on one thing or the other thing. Like, they're focused too much on the VASI or PAPI, and they're not checking their airspeed, so they get too fast or too slow. I mean, you can easily practice that in the sim so that your approaches become more smooth and stable. And the mental processes, meaning, what is your brain kind of need to learn in the background to be able to, when you're high on approach and slow, to make that mental connection of like, okay, when I'm high and slow, I need to push the nose down, and that will, help me speed up and also to descend more quickly. Things like that can be practiced over and over in the sim until they become very natural. So these are a few of the things that I feel sims are quite good at. Now, a bit of a paradox, though, is a lot of the trouble that students have. You guys can speak up if you feel the same way, but a lot of students, they come to us and they're like, yeah, I'm having a lot of trouble with my landings. And is there anything we can do to help me, fix my landings so I can solo quicker and that sort of thing? And unfortunately, the landing phase, I would say, is the part that is least possible to address well in a typical home simulator, because when you're doing the landing flare, it does depend a lot on those things that I mentioned the sim is not quite so good at, things like the seat of the pants feeling, feeling those little drops in the seat of your pants when the airplane is starting to sink. That tells you, okay, I've got to pull back more on the yoke, that control feel, the peripheral vision. So you can't get those very easily in a home sim. So that's the paradox is, most people want to learn that last few moments of the landing flare to be able to solo and move on in their training, but it's the part that's least possible to do well in a home simulator environment. So what's the way around that? Well, the thing is, there's lots of things that lead up to that landing flare, which occurs right here, that can basically allow you to focus a lot more of your mental energy on the landing flare when you're in the real airplane. So if you can master the rest of this pattern, all the other legs in the simulator, and maybe you don't focus on this last portion of the landing flare, but everything else up to that point is great, I can guarantee you that your kind of ability to hone and practice the landing flare at that point is going to become a lot easier, because most of the issues tend to start here on final approach that will lead to trouble with the landing flare, like coming in too fast or, coming in unstable and too high, things like that. So what we're going to do next is a demonstration on my own simulator of a traffic pattern, just so we can talk about some very specific ways that you might consider using a simulator to hone in on certain skills you might be having trouble with. And this will apply to whatever maneuver you're doing, even if it's not traffic patterns. This is a mess. First off, I apologize. This is a picture of the sim that I'm using right now. So I've got Logitech yoke and throttle and Thrustmaster rudders. These are pretty low-end controls, to be honest, but they get the job done. And just a single monitor here, just so you can kind of visualize what I'm using. So we're going to switch over now to X-Plane, and we're here on the runway of the Renton Airport. And I'm just going to talk through, the start of a traffic pattern and help you think of some, different stuff you can try as you're practicing. Or if you don't have a sim yet, to visualize like, okay, these are the things that I could be doing at home if I had a simulator and I were, using it effectively. So we're going to give that a try. So first off, when we start the sim, we don't want our view to be looking like this. We want to be seeing as much of the outside as we can. Taking up our focus. So I try to strategize, and, there's certain things I want to check on takeoff, like my temperature and pressure, for example. So I want to at least see that. But other than that, we try to see the minimum possible down here. So let's go ahead and take off. So I'm going to, heading is checked. So we're practicing procedures by checking our heading bug, smoothly applying full power. Temperature and pressure are in the green, and airspeed is alive. So we're practicing all of our call outs, practicing center line control. So I'm just going to pause here and there. So, center line control using the rudders, is it easy to do in here? No, you don't have the same feel. But if I can do it well in here by focusing on the visual cues of like, okay, right now the center line is sort of tilted off to the left. So that means I'm not quite there. So just, practicing and picking up on those things. There we go, 55 knots and rotate, watching my right rudder. So all these things are here in the sim. Now to rotate the airplane, it feels a lot different than the real thing, but it doesn't matter. I'm flying a sim 172. So right now I can be practicing my scan pattern. Like I want to be scanning from here down to the ball to the airspeed. My eyes have to be darting back and forth between those, and I can practice that perfectly well here in the sim. I can do another iteration of this with a crosswind next time, so I can practice maintaining center line if I want to. Can just do these takeoffs over and over again until you've exhausted all the different variables. I'm practicing thinking right now about, okay, if my engine failed, where would I go? I can dip my nose here to see, okay, there's a field here I could consider going to. So all these things. Here comes our turn for crosswind. I can first check for traffic off to my left, clear left, and we make our turn. All right, so I'm practicing maintaining the turn, using the outside reference for my bank angle. And here we go, coming up on crosswind. And so I'm trying to level off, and maybe I did this and I'm like, oh, do you know what? I didn't do that quite right. I completely missed that I needed to roll wings level on my crosswind. So what can we do? Well, it's super easy to kind of, replay our flight so we can, try to understand what happened. So I can just go into replay mode, slide this back, and see exactly what was going on at the time. So here's my turn to crosswind, okay? And, I should have been rolling wings level right about here. But this is also when I was coming up on my altitude. So, kind of debriefing myself now, I need to realize that, well, when you're coming up on your altitude, don't forget about your heading. So I'm going to do another run now. Same thing. I can, reload the flight and practice that very thing. I can set even a saved scenario point right before I turn my crosswind and then come back to that so I don't have to fly the whole pattern over again. Super efficient. I can do that takeoff, I don't know, how many times in an hour, maybe at least, 30 to 40 times in an hour if I wanted to. Much better than what we can do in the real airplane, right? So if we continue on with our pattern, we'll just go ahead and kind of level off here. Now, if I had a VR headset, I would have a much easier time to be, checking for, we're in the replay mode still. That's why we're not going. I'd have a much easier time to be, looking around the airplane and visually scanning for traffic and basically going between the forward view and the side view. I don't have a VR headset right now, so I have to basically use buttons on my yoke that I pre-assigned to those functions. So that's what we're doing now. And then, we can practice, even if we're not flying on a online air traffic control network, I can be thinking about, okay, right now the controller would probably be asking me say type landing. What would I say back to that? And, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. So I'll pause the sim. I press P. I can be thinking, okay, what's the controller probably going to say next? They're probably going to say safe type landing. And then I'm going to tell me like the option, or touching it, whatever, just so you can take this step by step and really think through each, part of the process. And that's why we call this chair flying 2.0, because, this is what chair flying is about, but this is way more visual and immersive, right? So that's the idea, and we'll kind of finish off this pattern talking about a few things. So we're at our beam, the touchdown point. Yeah, so we're going to bring the power back, add our flaps, so we can be focusing on okay, my instructor told me I need to watch my heading in this part because I tend to be turning. And I also tend to get slow, so I'm going to try to maintain 80 to 85 knots right now. That's what my instructor debriefed me on, so we can be using this as a debriefing tool. All right, and then we're checking for where the runway is when it's off of our shoulder, 45 degrees. That's when we want to make our turn. All right, so we can do the same thing in here. It's just harder. It's It's harder to be going back and forth, with these view controls when you don't have a VR headset, but it's doable. So we're making our turn. All right, so we'd be thinking about, are we using our rudder? The rudder coordination is all modeled in here. The trim is modeled in here, so we can be practicing the proper trim controls. All right, so then we're trying to figure out when do we turn final. I mean, this is another piece that student pilots have a lot of trouble with, is when to turn final. So if that were me and I were having trouble with this, I could go right now and hit save flight, and I could say, this is Renton Airport, and then I'll put base final. So we save this as a situation. And I'm going to go ahead and, try to see how I do on this one. I'm going to check. Yep, not quite there yet. A little bit longer. All right, we're going to check for traffic coming in on final. Final is clear. And let's try to turn final now. You can see managing the views. It takes some practice. Okay, there's a runway, so that went pretty well, but maybe I want to try another variation, but with a crosswind. So if I go load flight, and then I can go, the one I just set was Renton base to final, load it again. I don't have to wait to fly an entire pattern. I just load up the scenario again, and I can change the wind conditions so that maybe this time we have a crosswind on final or on base, whatever the case may be. You can easily set that up with this instructor station. You just click to change the weather. There's, wind control. You set the winds to whatever you want. I'm going to set them like this here to make it very obvious. And then I'll hit change weather. And then we can continue our flight with another new variable here. The winds this time are a headwind. So when we have a headwind on base, we have to think, well, what does that mean? I'm going slower now, so I can wait a little bit longer before I turn final. All right, so maybe instead of turning where I did before, I turn a little bit later down the road. All right, so there we go. We're turning final, checking our coordination, checking our speed. And you can see, even though I tried to turn later, I still turned a little bit too early. So I could do it again and see, what is the proper timing when you've got that headwind like I have it set to. So that's the idea. And now in this phase, this is where, the biggest bang for the buck is for a lot of student pilots, is practicing, after you turn on to final, how to get this right. So one aspect, of course, is the center line control. We can do, dozens and dozens of approaches with different wind conditions and practice maintaining the center line, whatever the wind condition is. So you can see right now I'm having to crab quite a bit to get back to the center line, and we can practice that very easily. We can practice our scan pattern. That means having our eyes, dart back and forth between the runway and the airspeed. That's a great thing that you can practice in the sim. Will your eyes be in exactly the same position as the real airplane? No, but your brain's going to adapt. So these are the sort of things that I think for student pilots that are struggling with landings, if you can really nail down this pattern, so by the time you get on final, everything is nice and stable and you're on the glide path on the proper speed, then that last part of the landing is going to be a lot easier to execute and to learn and practice. You'll be able to focus more on what your instructor is telling you about that stuff, instead of your instructor yelling at you, you're too high, you're 5 knots fast, and you need to reduce power and all these things. It's a much better way to be prepared by, kind of practicing and really internalizing that stuff in the sim, where it is harder, a lot of things, like I said, with flying the pattern. But if you can do it well in here, in the real airplane, it should be a lot easier. All right. So again, going back to slides now, just the basic processes of using your sim is, identify some sort of area where you need to improve from your real flight lessons or from, just flying the sim on your own. And then try to use the replay mode to go and, figure out like, okay, what exactly did I mess up there? And then from there, you can go ahead and set up and save a efficient practice scenario that you can, whether it's final approach or base or crosswind, whatever. And then we can do it over and over and over again until you're completely sick of it, but you've really internalized what needs to be done and, are making those corrections in a way that's impossible to do in real life. Okay. Coming up on the end here, so a bit more information about integrating sim use during training. So if you're already taking real world flying lessons, kind of you can base your sim use on what you're doing in real life, of course, and what the weak areas are that you're encountering, what your instructor is telling you are your weak areas, and basically use it as a supplement. If you haven't started training already, then we on our website have a few different coaching plans that we use with our instructors for someone that's pre-solo, let's say, on, what are the biggest bang for your buck items to start off with before you ever touch a real airplane, if you would like to go that path. So, things like first you have to learn the fundamentals and kind of understand how do you trim the airplane and so forth. And then, you can be flying at that point, stabilized approaches, learning about wind drift and crosswinds, traffic pattern procedures, and, emergency procedures is kind of there's many other things that you can do, of course, in the sim, but I think if you have these fundamentals, these give you a lot you can practice and hone in the sim on your own, and then you get to the real airplane and, the other things like practicing your ground reference maneuvers and stuff like that. I mean, that's all just kind of, fundamental aircraft control, applying it in a different situation. So there's, kind of a progression like that. There's also, the ATC communication aspect of it, and that sort of thing. So that's, what I would recommend for someone that's trying to integrate the sim during the training. If you haven't already started with a real instructor already, kind of consider a progression like this here. If you've already soloed, let's say, then what are the main benefits or ways you can use the sim? I would consider doing a lot of cross-country flights on Pilot Edge. So this allows you to really integrate, all the different things that you've learned, with your flight planning and talking to ATC in a very immersive way. So I've mentioned Pilot Edge a few times, but just to more clearly define what it is. So Pilot Edge, it's a network that you can connect your simulator to with a simple software. It's easy to set up. And then you put on a headset. And then from there, you would basically treat everything as you would in real life for ATC communication. So you would set the exact frequencies you would in real life. And then you would simply use the push to talk button on your physical yoke or joystick. You push it, you talk, and then a actual human comes back and gives you instructions. They're generally not real life air traffic controllers, but this company, Pilot Edge, they've trained the controllers that they have to be at a very high standard that, is pretty much indistinguishable from real life. I think a lot of them are real pilots as well. So that's how it works, but it's highly advisable, for this stage of training to be doing lots of, cross-country flights on Pilot Edge, getting used to airspace, things like that. Of course, as you're working up to your check ride, you can be focusing on maintaining proficiency to, be meeting the ACS standards for your maneuvers and, keeping up on your emergency procedures and things like that. And then eventually, when it comes time for check ride prep, kind of, after you've done a mock check ride with your instructor in real life, maybe you do the same exact flight profile in the sim, 5 times and until you're super confident on, okay, I know all of the standards. You have time to, fly these things with the ACS along your side and be able to check yourself that way. So all good ways to be using this sim that you've invested in at this point to get the most benefit out of it. After your private pilot certificate, after you've achieved that, of course, the sim is great for IFR. I'm not going to talk about this because most people can envision why it's good for instrument training because, you're looking at a panel the whole time, and the sim is great for that. So definitely a great tool long-term if you suspect you might be going for instrument training as well. And then even if you're not doing instrument training, after you get your private pilot cert, there's a lot of things that you can do with the sim that I like to think of as pre-flight prep. So, we all know about, doing the basic briefing before our flight, with flight service or using ForeFlight and checking NOTAMs and stuff like that. But there's other things that, could really up your level of safety by, doing some additional homework. And the sim really lets you take this to the next level. Like let's make believe you're doing a flight from this airport here, Bremerton, to Tacoma for $100 hamburger, whatever. And, one of the things we'd like to brief is what are we going to do on takeoff if we have an engine failure? So you could look at Google Maps here and be like, okay, I'm taking off this runway here. These are some of the options I'm going to see. There's like a golf course here and, maybe a road. which is great to do that homework. But if you can actually see what this would look like at 600 feet AGL, from the perspective of you as the pilot in the pilot seat, that's way better. So if you can rehearse the flight on your simulator, especially if it's, an airport you're not typically flying at, then that's another layer of safety you can add by thinking about all these different what ifs and having backup plans that you've actually seen and experienced in that sim environment. Do you need a simulator? No. I mean, obviously, no. You can get your pilot's license no problem without a simulator. People have done it for decades. But is it worth it? It very well can be. If you're, someone who's 18 years old, let's say, and you learn things super quick and, you never need to repeat a maneuver and that sort of thing, maybe it's not going to help you as much because you're probably going to finish in 40 hours either way. But if you're more like most people and you're going to be finishing in well above 40 hours, it's not a question of, am I going to finish in the minimum time? It's like, can I try to reduce some of the time it's going to take and also to be more confident by the time I get to the airplane? This little breakdown I have here is, just kind of a notional example of someone that's going to practice maneuvers with their instructor. And, out of 3 hours from your day, let's say, maybe like 0.8 of that is, actually practicing those maneuvers, because you have to drive to the airport, you brief with the instructor, you have to pre-flight the airplane, taxi out, run up, get to the practice area, all these things. Then you look at the reverse on the same back. It's a lot of time wasted just to go, fly 0.8 hours, let's say, of practicing maneuvers. When you compare that to what you can do in the sim, you start up the sim immediately and you can be in the air already in the practice area and you just go for it. So from that perspective, it's, a big time saver to be able to practice this stuff at home in an efficient way. All right. Coming up on the end here, a few of the things that we offer at Flight Sim Coach that can help you with this sort of thing. So we have a private pilot prep system that involves, being able to use a simulator to its maximum benefit. So a couple of things I'll highlight that are, part of this. We have, of course, custom training. So we can, help you if you're struggling with a certain area of your training to be able to really hone in on it with that, CFI guidance. We have a version that's an intensive weekend prep program. So if you wanted to spend 2 days dedicated to really bringing your skills up as much as you can before you get back into the airplane, if you've been away for a while, or if you haven't touched the airplane yet, then we offer that intensive weekend prep program. And we also have a free ground school as well. It's an introductory ground school, so we don't cover everything in full level of detail, but it's a great refresher if you've already started a fully fledged ground school. And we use simulators to keep things interesting and to keep it more immersive, to show you like, okay, angle of attack, well, here's what it actually looks like out the window as we're flying. And the final question we'll cover is, do you have to be techie to use a flight simulator or to set one up? So I would say it depends a little bit. So ideally, I would try to keep things as simple as possible, try to use popular, well-supported hardware and add-ons. Like we have some people come to us that have purchased a simulator, a used simulator from eBay or whatever, and it has all these old components, and they were meant to run on much older systems of Windows. If that's the case, then you may be in a much more difficult situation than something where you can easily find tutorials online, and it's all modern, well-supported stuff. But it kind of depends on the simplicity of the sim as well. Something like this is a lot easier to manage than something with, like all these components, or even the VR headset does make it more complex. So there's a range of complexity and, how much techiness you have to get into. In terms of ways to get simulator help. So on our website, we do have a lot of free blog posts that go through, for example, on how to select what rudder pedals are, a good choice for your sim, and just basics of sim setup. There's a bunch of, resources, free community resources out there, different forums and things like that, where people are happy to help you. And then we also at Flight Sim Coach offer a consult service where if you don't have a sim yet, then we can walk through and understand, your budget and goals for the sim. We do the research for you, and then we provide basically a full shopping list. So you can just kind of go through and press buy and, have all the stuff come to your house. And then from there, we can remotely help set up the simulator through screen sharing software. So that's the other piece of, how we can help you if you decide to purchase a simulator. So that pretty much covers it, guys. So it's been a pleasure having you join, and I hope this was informative and gives you some insight on how you can integrate a sim into your flight training. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, info@flightsimcoach.com, or just go on flightsimcoach.com and you'll find contact information. So thank you all. I wish you guys a good rest of your weekend.